Hello and welcome back again from our break and from our discussion group. It is my pleasure to introduce our next guest. Reverend Claudio Carbales is an earth thinker, theologian, liturgist, and artist. He's a native Brazilian and completed his PhD in liturgy and theology at Union Theological Seminary in New York City in 2007. He earned his first Master of Philosophy degree in theology, philosophy, and history at the Methodist University of Sao Paulo in 1997, and a Master of Divinity degree from the Independent Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Sao Paulo, Brazil in 1992. In the summer of 2016, Dr. Carbales joined Union Theological Seminary in New York City as the Associate Professor of Worship. Reverend Carbales has 4 books in English: Rituals at World's End, Essays on Ecological, Ecoliturgical Liberation Theology from past year in 2021, Praying with Every Heart, Orienting Our Lives to the Wholeness of the World in 2021 too. What Does Worship Have to Do with It? Interpreting Life, Church, and the World Liturgically from 2019, and Eucharist and New Globalization, Redrawing the Borders of Eucharistic Hospitality from 2013. He is also the editor of a unique book of liturgical resources, Liturgies from Below, Prayers from People at the Ends of the World. And Dr. Carbales is also the author of 4 books in Portuguese and 2 edited ones, celebrating the work of J.C.C. Marasquin and Yvonne Guevara. Carbales is married with Katie Perla and has 3 kids. And I think that is 1 dog, but I could be wrong. Welcome, Dr. Carbales. I am so delighted to have you here. We're so delighted to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you. I feel so honored to be here with you all and with this fantastic idea that Cindy had to talk about the Rio Grande. And my talk comes from a video that I did at the local river here, because I'm trying to talk about Rio Grande by way of talking about the Cano da Gwynedd creek next to my house. So you see is about baptism, is more theological. So you will see the video now, and then at the end we get into conversation. Becky, would you please?
Follow the water, because where there is water, there's life. The water that comes from the mountains, from the sky, and they run into the creeks, the rivers, and the oceans. Where there is water, there is life. So today, I want to invite you to come and visit me at the Cano da Gwynedd Creek in central Pennsylvania. And how this creek is a precious creek for me and for my family and for this region. And I wanted to talk about Rio Grande by way of talking about the Cano da Gwynedd River, or creek. Come with me. Today, I want to talk about baptisms and how Christians deal with water through baptisms and ordinances. The word sacrament, for some, has many meanings, among them mystery and holy oath. Sacrament is the mystery of God's presence amidst us. The sacrament is that which is deeply sacred or turned sacred. Christians are divided over what is sacrament or ordinance, or how many sacraments there are. But for all of them, this is a very precious and sacred moment. Baptism is the initiation of the faithful, the way of knowing and experiencing what the Christian faith is all about. It is to become a part of a people. And water is the main element of this entrance into the gathering of a people. Going through the living waters, one becomes part of God's family. However, The problem with most understandings of the ritual of baptism, sacrament, or ordinance is that it became a spiritual activity mostly that happens intra-doors of the church, and the presence of the water cannot be understood outside of its own doctrinal realm. Baptism is an inner ritual of the church, insulated into its own world. Of course, it is in the world and for the world, but baptism have very little to do with rivers or oceans or bodies of water. The massive presence of metaphysics and spiritual understandings of the baptism rituals prevent us from consider the very presence of the water as something to relate or to connect more fully. Nonetheless, water is what actually makes baptism possible. There's no baptism without water, right? Well, there are few baptisms with sand in history. But the only thing about water mostly in baptism is the amount, right? Thus, someone needs to have lots of water going to immersion, some water pouring, or little water sprinkling when you do a true baptism. The religious leader who officiates the baptism is also important in that ritual, and the words said are extremely important. You remember very recently the case where this priest at St. Gregory, a Catholic church in Arizona, who realized that he had said the wrong words in the baptism rites he officiated, and as consequences, thousands of baptisms were invalidated? Father Andres Arango mistakenly said the phrase, "We baptize you," instead of "I baptize you," for years, and that was the reason of the canceling of baptism. As Father Arango said, he used an incorrect formula, which also invalidated marriages and other forms of holy orders. But what was the mistake? The Diocese of Phoenix explained, the issue with using "we" is that it is not the community that baptized the person, rather it is Christ and Him alone who presides at all of the sacraments, and so it is Christ Jesus who baptized, end quote. Well, this is extremely important for us here, and I'm going to take a different turn, respecting and honoring those who believe this way, but I want us to think about the pronouns here, I and we, because it matters. Because for me, in a society where individualism reigns, to set a communal ritual into an I formula tends to reinforce this individual relations with divine or shred forms of collective experience with God. It is to make hierarchy rules. I am the one who has the power to baptize you, but I know. Here's the thing. The priest is not the priest himself who baptized, but it's Jesus Christ. It is the church, right? It is God. So there is a collectivity structure of the power of the we in that I formula. Because an I is always a we. We are never an I by ourselves. There's always a we, a knowable, even if unmeasurable notion of we. Like me in this creek. My I here in this creek, in this bioregion, is that I'm never alone here. My I can only be understood in relation to other species that we can hear, that we can see, but also that we cannot see or hear or feel. When I arrive here, I'm stepping into an ancient space where flows and movements of life and death have been in concert for millennia. I am always already a we in this place, in a relation with other living beings, worlds together, distinct and together. So today I speak from my precious Conneaut Creek, and let me show you this. In my book, I wanted to say that I learned with indigenous people that we are responsible for 7 generations. The 3 behind us, ours, and 3 afterwards. So I put in my cover, my mother's holding seeds because she was a sower of seeds. And then at the end, I have this creek right here, Conagwinnett Creek. Because this is what I have to care for my kids and for their kids and for other generations. As for the generations of the birds, of the trees, of the creatures, of the creators. So let me tell you a little bit about this creek. This creek is a serpentine river, creek and river, which the indigenous people see sacred powers when they are serpentining, so to speak. The creek is a precious creek that ventures into the Susquehanna River. And the Susquehanna River is a huge, immense, precious, massive body of water with 444 miles long from Lake Otsego to Chesapeake Bay. The river, the Susquehanna River, provides 50% of the base fresh water, 18 million gallons per minute, 49 miles of streams, which this is one of them, in watershed with 31,194 creeks and rivers with names and with lots without names. It is the longest non-navigable river in North America. The name Susquehannock is thought to have been an Algonquin word meaning the people of the muddy river. See, the waters are muddy? I fear and tremble at this creek because it is the creek that belongs to this area. And also, it's all wet because it's season of rain. Because this river will go into the Susquehanna, which is the oldest and biggest river in the whole earth. The Susquehanna River was born 340 million years ago. Just to give you the perspective, the first human ancestors appears on earth 5 million or 7 million years ago. This river is 300 million years older. So much power. The river is so powerful that the mountains that you see, they were organized around the river and not the way around. The most ancient body of water on earth, blessed be, blessed be. However, it was also named the most engendered river in the United States in 2005 with excessive pollutions and dams. And this river has been dammed. But who cares? How many of us think about rivers? So many other things to think. As I look here at the bottom of the river, the water flowing, biofilms, which are dominant riverine biota, who carries an immense quantity of microorganisms who clean and purify the water. The possible snails, worms, frogs, mollusks, marsh birds, insects, invertebrate. There is indeed a whole world right here. If I look around me, there are the remains of what have been here a riparian woodland, which is a forested or wooded area of land adjuncted to a body of water such as a river, a stream, pond, lake, creek, reservoir. And these forests live off of the river, but they also protect the river from invasions, from pollutions, from erosions, to keep the life of the river going. Around here, you can see many trees. Many of them already dead. Red oak, pine oak, Norway spruce, Colorado blue spruce, red maple, sweet gum, sycamore, and on and on and on. And a whole flora and fauna that I still don't quite know. If I look up, the birds. I so wish I knew all their names. Through migration, birds of prey, such as hawks, eagles, osprey, harriers, pass by here. Flowers are everywhere. Perennials, astel, baptisia, bellflowers, catmint, Carbales, or plants such as ferns, club mosses, grasses, sedges, rushes, wildflowers, and on and on and on. There's so much ongoingness in this place. As I stand here, I also look back and see a history of colonization and erasure of indigenous people, animals, waters, entire biomes and biotas. I am part of the stories now because I live here. And I look to the future, I wonder, what is the future of this place? What is the future of my precious tree? Wonder. Who is perhaps the mother tree of this place? But she is also dying. Do you perceive that if we live off of the water, and if our baptism comes out of the water, there are worlds to be considered? Not only a ritual in itself, a whole full-fledged entanglement of worlds, many worlds, unique and different in its confluence. All of them, my friends, are part of the we of the ritual that makes the ritual of baptism possible. Because here, my friends, lies a whole cosmovision, a whole cosmology that entangle us into a wonder of God's creation. So today I'm concerned about the water and the way we objectify water, how we frame it, and in a distant and unrelatable ways. For the most part, we have only seen, perceived, and related to water as a second-class actor in our lives, and also in the baptismal ritual. The water is taken as a thing, a mere object without life. So we need to bless the water so the water can be actually a part of the sacrament ordinance. Without blessing, the water is just water, a dead thing. The water alone does not have an intrinsic sacred value because the water is never considered an agent, subject, a living being. Well, science tells us that water is not alive, right? Just this week, I was praying with my son Ike, and I said, thank you, God, for the waters who are alive, full beings who we must honor and be grateful for. Ike stopped my prayer, as he always does when he depends on what he hears and what he wants to say, and said, Dad, is the water alive? I said, yes, why? Because in science, we mostly learn that water is not alive. And I said, oh, that is why we need indigenous knowledge to go along with science. Because the people of the land everywhere relate to the water as a live being. This name, Susquehanna, were called by the people, as I said, as Muddy River, or it was called the Oyster River. The Krenaks in Brazil called the Sweet River by them Uatu. The oldest ancestor in their lineage is their uncle. The nomadic indigenous people called Rio Grande, Rio Bravo. We have to start to call on God's name by the names of our rivers, and our rivers might gain some kind of attention. The rivers are sacred, and they carry the very possibility of our living. Without the waters, without the rivers, we can't live. In baptism, theological problems have got us this far and disconnected to the earth. You know, we can cite the doctrine of creation, the doctrine of revelation, the doctrine of redemption, our eschatology. Everything has shaped us into a disconnect with the water and with our sacraments of Eucharist and baptism. As I said, in baptism the water doesn't mean much. It is the means of grace. In that way it is important, but it's not grace itself. Water is a venue of a spiritual life that does not have any relation with other ecosystems who carry life and sacredness in themselves. Oh, friends, I wonder how our theology and sacraments can become a network of worlds together. God, water, humans, beings, creatures, craters, trees, plants, fauna, flora. Talking about the Conondaquineth Creek, we need to talk about Rio Grande. And what I try to show is that the way we care for our local river is the way that we care for life in general. How can we relate to Rio Grande is by way of the rivers next to us. With this knowing that each river has a history, a story, a life. Differences, specificities that entail a different wording, and gesturing that needs to be considered around the sacrament and ordinance of baptism. The Rio Grande is a fundamental river in the United States since it has so many layers of meanings placed upon him. But who is the Rio Grande? The Rio Grande is not an an individual river, but a being living in a web of relations and connections between people and species. So you can never think of the Rio Grande as a river in itself, but again, every river as an ecosystem, a biome of relations. The same way that we did with every river, we did with Rio Grande. There's no agents, it's just a river. But we have to recollect the river as a we. Made of many thousand whys. And Cindy Rassi has perceived that we don't take care of the river as a life being unique, as being only caught into the notions of migration and politics. Cindy is asking us to let the Rio Grande flourish in our hearts, so we can relate to the Rio Grande and what happens in and through the Rio Grande in a very different way. Is the Rio Grande alive? It has been colonized in such deep ways that today the river is no more than a place fraught with political interpretations. It is not a river anymore. It is a border. It does not have fish. It has immigrants. It's a pathway to life or the presence of death. To this day, the Rio Grande has been framed as part of a war and a division of two different owners of the land, the Mexicans and the Yankees. The Rio Grande is only a geopolitical system without personhood. The river has been abused, brutalized, damned, like every river. By bringing this river to our conversation, I wonder how we can resurrect to our minds, to our hearts, the Rio Grande from the political narratives of our time that has stripped the river away from its own agency, from its own life. Because the river as it stands now is the border between US and Mexico. It is a place where immigrants cross into the United States. It is a place where people die crossing. It is a colonial wound marked by coloniality, white supremacy. The River Rio Grande is a colonial wound. Because of the sense of how we understand baptism, we needed to wonder how we call the Rio Grande. Where was he or she born? What is the subjectivity and forms of life? What is the river made of? Who are its living beings? What love and secrets it holds? What are the old stories that it created? How does the river fall in love with the moon every night and engage with the sun every morning? How does the river bless people who live nearby? Oh, my friends, we must challenge ourselves and consider the rivers near us as our ancestors. Full beings, full rights, who needs love, care, and protection. This way, we must reconsider the sacredness, the holiness of the Rio Grande. But there's a big problem when we do that. Why? Because if we consider that the Rio Grande is sacred, then we are demanded to reconsider a whole geopolitical system that locked the river into systems of thought and into a battlefield that is human and only human. The way we treat the rivers is the way we treat people. Or the way we use the rivers is the way we use people. The same way that we don't care about rivers, that we only use the rivers for our own needs, that's what we do with immigrants. We don't care about them, but we use them for our own needs. Neither the river nor immigrants have agency or sacredness. Their identity is attached to the condition of their utility. There is no distinction there. To discharge the life and sacredness of the river is also to discharge and dismiss the sacredness of the immigrants. The same way we have polluted rivers in this land, it is the way we have abused undocumented immigrants in this country. However, without the river we can't drink and we can't live. And without immigrants and undocumented immigrants, this country cannot survive. For Christians, just to give one example because of time, for Christians, the only possibility of the Eucharist for our communion on Sunday is because undocumented people are harvesting the land and picking up the wheat and the grapes for our communion, for our meal, holy meal. So the undocumented is what makes our sacredness, the sacredness of our faith possible. The same way it is the river next to our houses that make the sacredness of our baptism. There's no distinction. There's no cut between the river and the baptism, between the soil, the undocumented, and the holy bread and the wine, the Holy Ghost and the Holy Host. How can we love Rio Grande? We must start by loving our local rivers. How can we love the Rio Grande? By loving the undocumented people crossing it. What is your relation, my friends, with the rivers near you? I have a student who took a class at the Hispanic summer program with me and asked to do an eco ritual related to baptism. She went back to her church in a Sunday morning and she brought water from the local river. She went to the local river and got a bottle full of water from there, and during worship on Sunday at the time of baptismal renewal, she poured out the dirtiest, most stinky water with lots of stuff in it into the baptismal font. Everybody was grossed out. Then she got a branch with leaves drenched into the waters and said, "Let us renew our baptism," and gestured to sprinkle the waters into the congregation. Oh, the moment she did that, you wouldn't believe it. Some people literally went to the floor, while others literally walked out of the church. That story is for me the epitome of how Christians relate faith and waters of rivers. And that's how we relate to immigrants as well. If we have the immigrants, we call the police. So I imagine here, my friends, to do a renewal of my baptism. Going into the waters. I renew the baptism in the name of God of the earth, the Son of birds, and the Holy Spirit that lives in the waters of the Conneauguineth River. I renew my baptism in the ancient river, and I name all its fishes, birds, rocks, grounds, and vegetation, waters, flowers, plants. They all baptize me. They all are part of me. The waters of God are the living waters of this river. And today I promise that every time I say I will say we, humans and more than humans. So I promise to take care of this river more closely to me. I promise to pay attention to the flora and fauna of this place. We promise to take care of the birds, topsoil, worms, and every living creature. We promise to consider the baptism as the we of a whole biota and bioregion. We promise to clean the rivers. And I also renounce, we renounce the carelessness that we deal with this river. We renounce the consideration of any form of life without the natural world. We renounce the faith that only pay attention to humans and humans alone. We renounce the beast of capitalism that makes me disconsider other beings such as this river. We renounce the faith that talks about God's living water but cannot talk about our own rivers as living waters. And if we are at the Rio Grande, if I renew my baptism there, I also have to call upon the God of the earth, the Son of the birds, and the Holy Spirit of the Rio Grande, so that I can renew my baptism in that ancient river in the name of all the fishes, birds, rocks, bottoms, creatures, fishes, ground, vegetation, and in the name of every undocumented people who crosses it. So I would say, at the Rio Grande River, we promise to see Jesus Christ as the immigrant crossing into the desert and through the Rio Grande. We promise to take care of this river as I care for the immigrants. We promise to pay attention to the flora and the fauna of this river. We promise to disentangle the Rio Grande from all of the weaponry placed upon it. We promise to push authorities to care deeply for this river, giving its proper meanings, better metaphors, new symbols, and take it as its real living being. We promise to take all forms of life within and around that river. We promise to live out our baptism as we care for each immigrant, as we care for the whole biota and the bioregion. And as I renewed my baptism, I also renounce. We renounce the invisibility of the Rio Grande as a living being. We renounce the consideration of any form of life of the river without the natural world. We renounce the faith that does not sing with the river, does not go down to the river to pray. We renounce the wall that crosses the river, the weaponry, the army, and all of the money that is bleeding the river and the people and the animals who cross it. I renounce a faith that talks about God's living water, but cannot talk about the Rio Grande as the living waters. My baptism is only possible if all what I write and all what I do is drenched with the waters of the rivers near us. Amen.
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 I don't know about the rest of the attendance, but I was absolutely taken by everything that you shared. And I have questions. There are a couple of questions. We have a few minutes. But before we go into the questions, I just wanted to say again, thank you. Thank you. I hope it wasn't so cold.
It was really cold. I was hoping to go even deeper into the river, but it was freezing. So I had to stay at the very beginning. I was hoping to go all the way up here, but I just couldn't.
Oh, goodness. There is a question here, and it's this beautiful cosmological vision of baptismal relatedness with living rivers seems to be a metaphysical challenge to the substance metaphysics that ground classical Christian theology. Is that an accurate reading? What are some of the theological conversations that you are finding helpful in dismantling these metaphysical claims about divine perfection, meaning static and unchanging, impassible and omnipotent? Omnipotent.
That's so powerful. Goodness, I think we would need a whole semester to engage that question because it's beautiful. And I think it was Thomas, right? Thomas, it's you raise up, you go right into the heart of it, right? You go right into the pulsing of it, which has to do with what you said about the cosmology. And according to the cosmology, we have a sense of metaphysics. And according to the sense of metaphysics, we have a sense of substance. And it is a challenge for us Christians to engage with the structures of this binary thinking that we were that we were shaped as Christians, right? With this there's the Greek binaries, right? That we are that we composed our theology. So the very notion of bad and evil, it's one issue at the heart of it. The very notion of suffering, right? That the way that we understand suffering. We can say I mentioned quickly the doctrine of creation that is drenched into this Augustinian notion of sin, for instance, which makes everything be already tainted, fallen, and then our doctrine of revelation then is also based on this sense of natural revelation and full revelation that we see in Calvin and Luther and Wesley, which is a sense that the nature manifests God's glory, but to a point, and the fullness of God's glory, of God's self, is only in Jesus. And so we are afraid to mix. I mean, the whole problem, especially for Protestants, with the signifier and the signifier, right? There was always running away from Catholic understandings of the Eucharist, right? That's why you have the real presence. That's why you have the consubstantiation against the transubstantiation. And with that, what is it that you are transubstantiating into? So I'm just kind of giving ripple effects of what you have said, and I think not only that, but modernity has shaped us even more into an even more distinct and detached relation with the earth. The very creation of the word nature, which is a modern creation, which was the ways in which Europeans did not know what to do with it. So it gave this one name that encompasses a metaphysical being, pretty much like God, and we see that in Spinoza as well, right? And when Spinoza will call the earth the body of God, and then MacFague will call it God in more theological ways. the body of God. But the very notion of nature was this binary, is either this perfection that we are in awe, or is this very nasty, horrifying, destructive way of being. So we are again caught into this binary, because we still have notions of nature that is like a totalizing, universal notion of nature. And then we are caught into that, right? And so the very notion of God is also embedded into this dualism and these notions of this totality, right? And that's why we spiritualized, because we cannot be too much material, right? Because our faith is spiritual. So that gets us to split the material and the spiritual. And in that way, we are also caught into this dynamic. So we don't know exactly what to do with Jesus' incarnation in that sense. So is this incarnation only in humans? That's what we have in our theology. So not only the earth was the center of the universe, but the humankind, and let's be bluntly clear, the men are the center of everything, right? And we do everything in terms of humans and humanity. There's nothing that we relate that has to do with the earth. Like, I wish we would have John 3:16 that I grew up with, for God so loved the world that sent God's son. But that love is only for humans. It has nothing with anything else. It doesn't matter if that tree we take out because it's not a good decor, or it's just like it's not as beautiful, and so we are caught into that form of relationality, and this is also spilled into our sacraments. Right? We live off the two sacraments comes out of the land. Wheat, grape, for this more modern sense of meal, because it was a much faster meal, but we made it this very tiny representative meal. But even that meal, which is wheat, grape, and water, we have to transubstantiate it, or consubstantiate it, or at least bless it, for this to be a part of our sacraments. So all of this is to say that is complicated, and I think the more we learn with the earth, the more we go into new forms of understanding the earth, like Lynn Margulis, for instance, or indigenous knowledges, and also other forms of Saint Francis, or Teilhard de Chardin, of the Latin American from, I wrote about him when he died. I'm terrible with names. That has a whole book of 500 pages on one poem about the universe. I'll get his name, but I think we have plenty of resources. Thomas Berry, also Wendell Berry, who's a Baptist, and we have plenty of people, Ivone Gebara and Sally McFay, and so many other people that we can Nancy Cardozo, that we can relate that. And for me, unless we move to this way of thinking, there's not going to be earth for us to talk about the sacraments. There's not going to be soil, topsoil. There's not going to be water for us to talk about God's love. There's not going to be anything that makes us possible to talk about love, to talk about God. So for me now, it's unless we follow the law of the land, which is God's first love, law of the land, I think we don't have much future for our children. And we see, if you follow the IPCC reports, it's devastating. And it's not about 100 years or in 2500. We are talking about 10 years. and we already seeing all the disasters. So I think we are at a place where we, unless we move and shift and change,
Well, it has been definitely amazing to have you. Thank you so much. Wish we had even more time to continue. There are other questions, but we will definitely keep in touch. And I know that we will continue this conversation.
yes.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Cindy.
Carvalhaes.
Thank you to you all.
Thank you, everyone. And I have now the pleasure to introduce our next presenter as Richard Blanco, which is here with us. Richard Blanco is the 5th presidential inaugural poet in US history, the youngest first Latino immigrant and gay person to serve in such a role. Born in Madrid to Cuban exiled parents and raised in Miami, the negotiation of cultural identity and place characterize his body of work. He's the author of the poetry collections Looking for the Gulf Motel, Directions to the Beach of the Dead, and City of 100 Fires. The poetry chapbooks Matters of the Sea, One Today, and Boston Strong. A children's book of his inaugural poem, One Today, illustrated by Dab Pilkey, and Boundaries, a collaboration with photographer Jacob Hessler. His latest book of poems, How to Love a Country, in 2019, both interrogates the American narrative, past and present, and celebrates the still unkept promise of its ideals. He has also authored the memoirs, The Prince of Los Cocuyos, A Miami Childhood, and For All of Us, One Today, An Inaugural Poet's Journey. Blanco's many honors include the Agnes Lynch Starrett Poetry Prize from the University of Pittsburgh Press, the Penn Beyond Margins Award, the Patterson Poetry Prize, a Lambda Literary Award, and 2 Maine Literary Awards. He has been Woodrow Wilson Visiting Fellow and received honorary doctorates from Macalester College, Colby College, and the University of Rhode Island. He has been featured on CBS Sunday Morning and NPR's Fresh Air. The Academy of American Poets named him its first education ambassador in 2015. Blanco has continued to write occasional poems for organizations and events such as the reopening of the U.S. Embassy in Havana. He lives with his partner in Bethel, Maine. And today we have the pleasure to have him here. Bienvenido, Richard.
Hola, buenos dias. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. Gosh, what Claudio was talking, I was like, wow, I'm like, I was immediately like drawn. Wow, some really important stuff, very powerful. So I think the idea is for me to speak about the poem a little bit and then give you a reading of the poem. So as you mentioned, Cindy, there's the book Boundaries, which was a collaborative project with photographer Jacob Hessler, is where this poem originally came from. It appears in How to Love a Country, but it first originated in that collaboration. He took photos, and I responded with poems, and in a few cases I wrote the poem first, and then he had to go to find the photograph for it, which I think was the tougher end of the deal. But as the title suggests, or more than suggests, the theme was boundaries, and all sorts of, not necessarily borders, but boundaries, all kinds of boundaries. Boundaries are around sexuality, boundaries around gender, boundaries, psychological boundaries, boundaries of race, and of course, literal boundaries or physical boundaries, like El Rio Grande. And so when I was presented with the photo, which I want to share with you just so you can see that for a minute. That was the photo I was working off of. I'll just stop that. as I get really small, right? um, if you saw from that photo, there's sort of a sense of most of Jacob's work is like this is kind of absent of humans, but more not just sort of literally in the photo, but more feeling of this vastness and this sense of almost kind of what Claudio was talking a little bit, almost like what the earth would be like before we were ever here, or what it's going to be after we're not here. And so unlike other photographs which I read about, or I love photographs which kind of give me a narrative, kind of implied or more than implied, sort of really sort of drill a narrative into your mind. This vastness, this emptiness makes me want to fill in that space with a narrative, with a story. What is happening here? Who is here? Who is what and why, or who is not here and why, right? And so, of course, this is part of the river that forms the border between US and Mexico. And I started thinking at first at how peaceful and quiet that is compared to all the noise of the issue, quote and unquote, of Mexican migration, a noise that I've been hearing since I was a child, right? I wanted to speak to that. Obviously, that's the kind of boundary that we're trying to think about in this photo. But at the same time, I was I didn't feel I could speak because it's not my direct experience. Cuban, so I don't know what that immigration feels like. I've certainly read enough about it, but I haven't experienced it. And I thought, well, what does the river think? Right? What has the river witnessed, and what would it say if it could speak? So I ended up writing a persona poem, which is basically a poem in the voice of someone else or something, to let the river sort of expound this and speak with a different kind of authority that I couldn't. And also it's a technique to sort of objectify the issue. So if the river's telling you something, right, there's this argument, right? The river is eternal, right? Or not eternal, but so I'm not picking sides in a way. It's the river's just being, when you read the poem, the river is really being evenly heavy-handed to everything. It's not just bad America, right? Or it's more like, how'd you all get here in the first place to this mess, right? As of course, in the poem, what I wanted to speak of is, that absurdity of borders, of national borders, especially, which I've probably always been absurd, but I find them even more absurd in today's world, where everything is interconnected. Our economies, we saw with the pandemic, how every single thing, from every job, our whole globe is sort of connected in that way. And sort of this outdated notion of a nation state, which has in part something of what Claudio was talking about, sort of limits cooperation in other ways. That this idea that we have a country with these neat little borders, and you're there and I'm here, and we're competing for resources, and we're competing for this or that and the other, and we're basically forming these borders as artificial ways to control, obviously, power and wealth, right? With the border between U.S. and Mexico, as was mentioned in some of the write-ups for this, it's especially absurd, and because this is a region that has shared hundreds and hundreds of years of various cultures, of history, of so much. This is a region. This is not a border. I don't know if you all know that part of the reason that there was that border put in place was, I think it was President Polk. Basically, they didn't want Mexico because there were too many brown people, and that's not the vision the founding fathers had for the United States. So that's part of the history of that border. But also, when I have a favorite poem by Alberto Rios that talks about the border. A border is a divide, but a border is also a meeting place, right? It's also a union of things, if we want to look at it that way. And that's kind of what the poem is also saying, like, let's look at it this way instead of the other way. This is actually a place where we can meet, where people do meet. So I'll say that about it. And then for me, I think, yes, it's the river speaking, but in some ways, so I feel closest to the divine when I am in nature, which is interesting what we're talking about with what Claudio sort of talking about. I feel in union with the divine most in those settings, especially the beach, which I grew up with in Miami. And so it's more than the river, the voice of the river. To me, it's also the voice of the divine. It's sort of saying, like, what have you done? This is not what I meant. And that's part of what's going on in there. So yeah, I'll just say that. And then let me just read it. The dedication here is for Aileen Barbieri, which is who is one of the girls in an all-girls orphanage that I have worked with in San Pedro Sula through the Episcopal Church, through the Archdiocese of Miami. I'm not Episcopalian, but somehow I've done more projects with Episcopalians than anybody else. Her story is just insane of some of what's happened to her because of this whole, well, the border issue, the whole Mexican, Central American immigration and whatnot, and what's happening obviously in San Pedro Sula with and most of Central America with the drug trade, trafficking, and whatnot. So I dedicated the poem to her as sort of one of the victims of this whole border mess. Complaint of El Rio Grande. I was meant for all things to meet, to make the clouds pause in the mirror of my waters, to be home to fallen rain that finds its way to me, to turn eons of loveless rock into love-sick pebbles and carry them as humble gifts back to the sea, which brings life back to me. I felt the sun flare, praised each star flocked about the moon long before you did. I've breathed air you'll never breathe. Listen to songbirds before you could speak their names, before you dug your oars in me, before you created the gods that created you. Then countries, your invention, maps jigsawing the world into colored shapes, caged in bold lines to say you're here, not there, you're this, not that, to say yellow is in red, red is in black, black is not white, to say mine, not ours, to say war, and believe life's worth is relative. You named me, big river, drew me, blue, thick, to divide, to say spick and Yankee, to say wetback and gringo. You split me in two, half of me, us, the rest, them, but I wasn't meant to drown children. Hear mother's cries. Never meant to be your geography, a line, a border, a murderer. I was meant for all things to meet. The mirrored clouds and suns tingle, bird songs and the quiet moon, the wind and its dust, the rush of mountain rain, and us. Blood that runs in you is water flowing in me. Both life, both the truth we know is to be one in one another. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Thanks.
As I told you, I mean, through email, that this was one of the inspirations for the conference to be, because it encapsulates a lot of what I wanted to talk about today, and what our presenters have talked about. And it's very moving as well, because I do feel like you did an amazing job.
Thank you.
and you can feel like the voice of the river, that speaks to not just the river, but how nature can talk to us.
Yeah.
If we listen, if we pay attention. So I do have a few questions for you.
Sure.
And some of them are about the fact that you wrote this poem years ago, and you will think, oh yes, definitely, things might change, things might look different, but now that the time has passed, what do you think is different about the way we engage in conversations about white supremacy, environmental racism, faith and spirituality? Do you see a difference? Do you see like people are engaging more or not? Do you see that there is something that has changed, or everything remains the same?
Well, I think for me, I think it's fairly obvious, but we are having in the past years, we are having reckonings of all kinds, and I think so. Our dialogue is different. It's more polarizing, obviously, but I feel like in periods of reckoning that it almost has to happen. There's a lot that hasn't been said by both sort of sides of the equation, or both sides of an issue. There's been a lot of hidden, stealthy kind of racism that finally is starting to come out. A lot of stealthy white supremacy thoughts that people just weren't voicing, but kind of not white, but feelings, right? And so I think we're engaging differently, much more violently, and I don't mean that just in terms of physical violence, but in terms of language. I'm also, but for me, I mean, at least I see it as a growing pain, and I see it as something necessary in the evolution of a country. Where in some ways also I've been thinking that America has never had sort of its post-colonial reckoning. We kind of broke away from the English Empire, but basically we just sort of stayed like the British. I mean, I don't mean to disregard the sense that it was a great social experiment. It still is. I'm a total patriot in that sense, and that comes from being an immigrant and appreciating this country in ways that sometimes we forget. But still, it kind of went about our own business and became our own little empire, and like kind of became England, right? Whereas much of the New World had to have some of that reckoning in many different ways. So I think we're, we call it woke or whatnot, but we're finally addressing a lot of the contradictions, a lot of the hypocrisy of our nation, and continuing it to shape it. I like to think also like in really broad or long historical arcs, and the idea that if you look at any country, name me a country. Well, there's probably a few, but most countries don't have exactly the best record, clean record either. So I am patient with that, but also thinking about what a infant nation we are, thinking about the long strokes, the long arcs of where this might end up that I may not get to see in my lifetime, right? Good or bad. I think of a book I wrote I wish I read a long time ago, called The Cathedral Builders. And it used as a metaphor, it wasn't necessarily about cathedral builders, but how entire communities, right, entire towns, cities would participate in the building of something that they never knew would probably never see finished in their lifetime. I think we're still waiting for La Sagrada Familia to be done, right? And that's always stayed in my mind as to whenever, at what point where I find myself in relationship to our country's evolution, my evolution with my country. I don't like it. I don't like the space we're in right now, but it's movement, I guess.
Yeah, I like the idea of growing pains, which definitely, I mean, if you work with words and what it means to use our voice and how far we can go with that, right? What is that we can gain by using certain words? And especially in this poem, you know, I know that you were saying, oh, I'm trying to talk about the photos, or maybe the process in that book was like maybe you wrote first the poem and then the photo was done, but still we're trying to move in a different direction, right, with those words. So how there is another issue, or not another question. It's how do you see our artistic responses to environmental issues, in particular poetry, and are having an impact or can have an impact today?
So a couple things to that. So the eco poets, which I teach, right, and specifically in relation to climate, right? You're talking about? Right?
Yes, I mean, definitely.
Yeah. And actually, I teach a unit on that, and I've gotten a little more familiar with the work of eco-poetics. First, I want to say that I am not one of those people that thinks a poem will change the world, right? I'd be a fool to think that. What I can say is that a poem can change a human being, and that human being can change the world. And that's really the idea, right? So whatever work you're doing, for example, you can use poetry to prop that up, to support that. You know, I was thinking, what if some fifth grader reads a poem that stays within them all their life and they grow up to be president of the United States, right? Like, so I just want to be clear, is I'm not, art functions in a way that's very stealthy, right? We don't always see the ripple effects of that. You know, it's I always keep that in mind for myself, but also I like to say that poetry is a tool for all of us to use in whatever capacity we work. So the eco-poetics, and I think one of the things, so I should say that one of the things that poetry does best, as I think this poem does, not all my poems do this so well, is they open up a third question, or they open up, they make you look at it differently. It's not, you know, I could have easily written the, you know, pro-Mexican immigration, anti-America bashing poem, right? This made me think myself differently. I'm like, this is a bigger issue than just this is a larger issue, right? It's an issue that can apply to many contexts and many places, right? So that's what I try to do in all my social political poems, or even my personal poems, is to find something else that I hadn't thought about, and therefore the reader goes, oh, I hadn't thought about it this way as well. What the eco-poetics have, eco-poets have done, a lot of people, so if you want to read really bad eco-poetry, read some by, what's his name? An Inconvenient Truth. He's written some poems. I forget the name. Come on, help me. Gore Vidal. No, not Gore Vidal. That's a whole other guy. You know what I'm talking about. Because it's just on the nose, right? It just gives you exactly what we already know, right? So really in the more poetic, the eco-poetic world, there's a couple things they try to do, is not to think of ourselves as separate from, like, this is something that we're doing to the earth, but rather that we're doing to ourselves, that we are part, to really acknowledge that we're part of the ecosystem that is killing itself from the inside out. And that we do that in many ways. We do that in ways that are not just about the environment, right? We destroy ourselves. You know, they really examine these intense questions. They try to avoid, so they're not nature poems. They try to dig beneath that. Oh, look how beautiful this is. Let's praise this thing that we're destroying. So they try to get even deeper than that. And they try to avoid anthropomorphizing, right? Is that the right word? The nature. So because that's kind of a cliche for them. And just really look at the intricacies of our relationship with the earth and nature and whatnot, in ways that become really stark and surprising, because they're not like the Save the Earth poems, and some of them, frankly, are just can be pretty bleak in terms of what they're uncovering. But there's a great poem by last name Saint Germain. It's called Midnight Oil. If you want to look it up, it is just an amazing poem. It's about the Gulf oil spill, and it's just amazing how she compares her life to the spill. Her dad drinking himself to death, and like just the ways in which we destroy and how we're part of yeah, it's just like, it's just one of the best. And it's so deceiving because you think at first, what is this poem about? And then you realize this is an intense 4-page eco-poem, eco-poetics at its best. So so that's what I think and all poetry can offer, is that other further kind of investigation, that third question, a different kind of discourse, a different course of action that we don't usually have when we're just talking about issues on a very polarized level. I mean, poets, I think, take the time to really question their assumptions and really uncover and research. Like a lot of that Boundaries book took a lot of research, like just plain old research about many different topics. There's poems about other things, about lynchings and about Chinese immigration. And so, yeah, I think poetry offers that. And I'll say one more thing. Poetry does it in a way that obviously other genres don't. Poetry does it by a direct appeal to emotions, right? So poetry is closer to song and much closer to music than it is to actually English class. In some ways, it's very soul, it's very nature, it's DNA sprung out of oral tradition. It is the proverbial campfire sprang out of song and collective activities, song, prayer, chant, war chants, everything. It's lived in the ether, and it's lived in our ears for thousands and thousands of years before it was ever on the page and lived in our eyes. And so a poem has that power, like music, and you know that a poem is not pontificating, it's not scholarly. It can have some of those elements, but at the core of it is an emotional appeal through the lens of witness of the self. And that, I think, is ultimately, you add music to anything, right? Everybody's experience becomes different, right? Like that's why they use music in television, at stockbroker meetings, at all kinds of things, because it gets to us in a different way. It imparts knowledge through a shift in emotion rather than anything sort of cognitive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that one of the things that personally has happened to me throughout the MDiv program is my approach to poetry, and not just the approach, but just every time I go somewhere, someone hands out a poem, I'm like, wow, what's happening here?
Yeah, and I
It's
think
a language that is happening a lot in this
yeah,
faith, religious, spiritual.
yeah, and I think in relation to your first question, you're seeing more poetry in the world because of that very issue of we're having to think of we're thinking we're reckoning, we're confronting, and we need different language. We need something else to sort of have that dialogue around, or to push back against something. Yeah, I agree. Seeing poetry in a lot more places in the last 10 years.
Yes, absolutely. I do have a question for you, and
Okay,
it's
here's a station just for
sorry,
you.
it was my Siri. Thought that I was talking to her. You were born in Madrid, right?
What's that?
You were born in Madrid,
Yes.
and then you grew up in Miami, and your parents were from Cuba, and you live in Maine, right? So it sounds like the Atlantic Ocean has been part of your story somehow here and there. So what I was trying to go to is like water, no? That theme of water, that it's somewhat present for everyone in a different way. For me, it's the mountains. I grew up in Los Andes, so the mountains are present for me all the time, and they live within me. I was wondering about that. Do you feel that that shows up in your poems, or in the way you precisely, for example, engaging in this poem in this way?
Yeah, it's definitely sort of it's imprinted in me, in my consciousness and subconsciousness, like since going to the beach since I can remember. It shows up in my poetry all the time. It's kind of like my sort of Jungian imagery that keeps on coming up. Clouds, and especially like clouds too, over the ocean, seagulls, sand, oceans, waves. I mean, it's just constantly, it's my constant, it's like I said, that's partly where the divine really shows up for me. And that's where I go pray, that's where I go meditate, that's who I talk to. Let's see something responding to that. Well, I have if we have time, I have a poem that speaks exactly to some of that, because it's my obsession with the ocean, with the waves, with the sea. But one of the things that I think about a lot is sort of the landscapes in which we live in, right? And so what each of those so I'm also a civil engineer. I don't know if everybody knows that, but was a practicing civil engineer for 25 years. And I specialize in urban development, city revitalization projects. So I feel there's like three major landscapes that we inhabit or move through. One is the physical man-made world, or human-made world, right? We live in spaces, like we live in houses, we live in buildings, we live in churches, and we make these spaces. And then there is what I call the emotional landscapes, which are these spaces are really meaningless unless something happens in them, right? And our attachment to place is because something happened. And when that physical space is gone, we feel something emotional shift, or sometimes we go back. Our emotional landscapes has changed, and we go back to these spaces and don't feel the same way, or feel threatened by them, or feel disassociated by them. But the third for me is the natural landscapes, which are a kind of universal home, right? This is why it appears so much in poetry. It's like, who doesn't belong to the moon, right? Like, and the other, what I think about the natural landscape is, and the ocean in particular, is that it comes on its own terms, right? So everything else we feel as human beings that we can manipulate. And I know Claudio said, yes, let's chop down that tree, and we do that, right? But if you're not of that ilk, you're not like, well, maybe we should move that 400-foot pine tree this way because it's blocking my view, and there's a peace and surrender, that knowing that this is so much bigger than me, and that I have no say. I mean, it is what it is. It comes on its own terms, and I think that in some ways that surrender is I feel the divine in that surrender. I feel grace in that surrender, and surrendering to nature, and also, and this is what that other poem talks about. I think nature is a great sort of model about how we are for even our emotional landscape. So like, you know, I'm sure when you saw the mountains, every time you saw the mountains, they looked different, right? There's something different about them, yet they were the mountain. And so how do we as human beings who crave constant variety, who want adventure, who want to wake up the next day and become a doctor, you know, instead of a poet, who want this, how do we be different every time? How do we look at the world differently every time, and yet have a center, right? Have a sense of wholeness, an integrity. And that to me happens with the ocean. You know, it's never the same twice, and yet it's still the sea. It's really fast. I'm fascinated by that aspect of nature and try to think about it. Applying it to my own life and so on.
Yes. I think that we have time for that poem.
Yeah. Okay. Now, or you might as well do it now, right?
Yeah.
Let's see if I can find it here.
In the meantime, I know that you were recognized by Miami as the first Laurel poet. What was
The first poet laureate of Miami-Dade County.
Miami-Dade County. Yeah.
I didn't have one. So yeah, this is the poem, and I think it you know, like a lot of what I said, but also the intersection of that emotional landscape and that history with the ocean, with the beach, with that natural landscape. Some days the sea is never the same twice. Today the waves open their lines, mouths hungry for the shore, and I feel the earth helpless. Some days their foamy edges are lace at my feet, the sea a sheet of green silk. Sometimes the shore brings souvenirs from a storm. I sift spoils of seagrass, find a broken finger of coral, a torn fan, examine a sponge's hollow throat, watch a man-o-war dye a sapphire in the sand. Some days there's nothing but sand, quiet as snow, and I walk eyes closed on the wind, sometimes laden with silver-tasting salt, sometimes still as the sun. Some days the sun is a dollop of honey and raining light on the sea, glinting diamond dust. Sometimes there are only clouds, sometimes solid as continents drifting across the sky, other times wispy white roses that swirl into tigers, swirl into cathedrals, swirl into hands, and I remember some days I'm still a boy on this beach, wanting to catch a seagull or cup a tiny silverfish in my hand, build a perfect sandcastle. Some days I'm a teenager, blinded to death, even as I watch waves seep into nothingness. Most days I'm a man tired of being a man, sleeping in the care of dusk's slanted light, or a man scared of being a man, seeing God in the moonlight streaming over the sea. Some days I imagine myself walking the shore with feet as worn as driftwood, old and afraid of my body. Someday, I suppose I'll return someplace, like these waves trickling through the sand, back to the sea without any memory of being here. But if I could choose my eternity, it would be here, aging with the moon, enduring in the space between every grain of sand and in the cusp of every wave and every seashell's hollow. definitely part of my my imagery. In fact, I'm writing another book right now, and I have to start weeding out, like, there's so many palm trees and this and that, and I have to start shifting the images or changing them a little bit, or like leaving them in one poem and taking them out of another because it's obsessive.
I saw a photo, yeah, of the process, and I think that it was LinkedIn or Facebook. I don't know where I saw it, but I did see a little bit of that process.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Thank you for sharing. It was beautiful. I think that we have.